see. Yeah, it's a start, I think. Okay, good. So Dr. Whitney, welcome, Dr. Whitney, and he's the president right now, and he will give the presidential address.
Thanks, Dr. Song. Good to see you, and good to see everyone here at this irregular, I think we can call it, gathering of the North American Paul Tillich Society. It may be a little bit our fault that 2020 has gone this bad. You elected a Confucian to run the society for a year, and Confucius offered the curse, "May you live in interesting times," and 2020 has certainly been interesting times for all of us, I think, especially here in the United States with elections and great social unrest, but then globally with the COVID-19 pandemic. So here we are gathered for a shorter session than what we would normally have at the Tillich Society. On the other hand, there have been some remarkable opportunities over the last year for scholars and academic organizations to learn some new skills. New skills are good things, and to learn to gather in new ways. And it's wonderful to be able to welcome folks to this gathering today who may not have been able to be with us had we been gathering in person here in Boston. So there are some opportunities as well as some difficulties that we've experienced in the past year. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for being here. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Just to add to our agenda a little bit at the end of the day, we will have a brief meeting at the end to deal with a little bit of society business. Normally, this is the conclusion of the leadership year. But we have to deal with how we're going to move forward as in terms of leadership for the future, for the coming year in light of the disruptions of the past year. So a little bit of time and a little bit of update as well from regarding the Complete Works of Paul Tillich in English project, some exciting news there, so stay tuned for that. But I'm going to turn things back over to my dear friend Bin Song to get us going and have an exciting time discussing the crisis and what Tillich has to teach us about what we're living through in this particular moment. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Whitney. Yes, let's go to the panel part. You know, according to the officers, the meetings, the idea, we just wanted the theme of this conference very timely. So the assignment given to each speaker is, you know, keep it short, but just on the point. And we hope we can elicit lots of discussion, either within the time window of 10 minutes or after during the global discussion. So our first speaker is Ms. Marion Pauk, and she is the co-author of Paul Tillich, His Life and Thought. He actually writes this book with his late husband. And unfortunately, she gets a very bad cold, and she emailed me very kindly several days ago, says she wrote her paper, and we'll let the second speaker, you know, our old friends, our mentor of the society, Professor Fred Perla, to read it. So Fred, can you help to read it?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. First, I must regrettably tell you that Marion's paper, which she sent to me earlier this week, and I read it carefully, and it is an excellent paper. And she said, well, send it back and I'll make a few little suggestions. I just thought it went on too long. I said, well, maybe you want to just cut it by a few minutes. And then Marion and she and I have been good friends. She doesn't live too far from me, and we've shared a lot of Tillich stories through the years, some of which I can't share publicly with anyone. Thank you, Averna, for chuckling. She then proceeded to lose her paper, and she's not a computer whiz. As you know, I've been called Dr. Low-Tech at the university. I'm afraid Marion is around my speed. And so we have no paper for her to deliver, and I know she regrets that and sends her regrets. And I don't know if you're tuned in, Marion. It's a little early. It's a little after 7 on the Pacific time. I'm on Mountain Standard Time, so it's only a little after 8. I'm having my first cup of coffee, and I'm sorry Christian Dance could not join us, but of course it's already after midnight. in European time. So I will then go ahead and read my own paper and entertain questions, and I hope it goes well. So thank you again, and thank you especially for the invitation. Tillich and the pandemic, that's what we're talking about. When I first decided on this particular topic, I thought it would be unique to Tillich scholars. I also then discovered that most of the speakers were all talking on the same subject. In these few minutes, suffering as all of us are with this deadly coronavirus and the great interruptions it has brought to our lives, I want to suggest a few insights from the thought of Paul Tillich. Our considerations will be, first, his understanding of the demonic, and second, his comments on health and disease. Excuse me. I hope that this may give us a greater perspective on our terrifying situation. If Tillich were with us today, he would surely discuss the pandemic in medical, historical, theological, and spiritual terms. I'm also certain he would make public announcements that would be sharply critical of how the American government has dealt with the crisis. The government's failure to attack the pandemic in a timely manner, as well as its utter unwillingness to create an organized plan in dealing with it, has caused unnecessary and tragic deaths of tens of thousands of Americans. That is true, of course, all around the world, but this is the particular situation here in the United States. Tillich's book, The Meaning of Health, comprised of 2 lectures delivered in 1946 and 1961, was published some decades after his death. In many of his other writings, Tillich has little to say specifically about physical health and disease. Thus, in order to understand what he might say today about the pandemic, one must explore his ontology, especially his treatment of the ambiguity of life in the 3rd volume of the Systematic Theology. Tillich, as one knows, was a dialectical thinker. In his ontology, being makes no sense without the possibility of relative non-being. Non-being needs to be, but when non-being dominates being, the demonic power within being emerges. He knew that whenever the depth of life expressed in divine imagery is expelled from our human understanding, such divine depth reappears in demonic guise. Thus, he sees life only, quote, in the divine demonic ambiguity. So too with the meaning of health. Tillich says, health is a meaningful term only in confrontation with its opposite, disease. And disease contains a partial negation of the essential nature of man. Conversely, in order to understand disease, one must know the essential nature of man as well as the possible distortion of it. Close quote. Again, he says, in this sense, health is disease conquered, as eternally the positive is positive by conquering the negative. Close quote. What does this ontological framework have to do with the current coronavirus pandemic? Tillich, I think, would surely see the pandemic as the radical emergence of non-being, the appearance in history of what seeks to negate and destroy history. Demonic forces pulsate through all of nature, from the inorganic to the organic to the level of spirit. Likewise, these forces overpower all of the dimensions of the human person, the biological, the psychological, the historical, and the spiritual. Has our culture considered the pandemic in clearly defined finite categories, medical, political, financial? Tragically, the pandemic will endure until our culture understands that the disease is attacking the very roots of being itself. Does our culture have both the ability and the will to fortify itself against such a powerful enemy? Excuse me. I didn't get up in time to have my second cup of coffee. Perhaps if he were with us today, Tillich might begin with this question. To what degree is personal health possible in a society which is not a sane society? Close quote. Are people confronting the darkness, the demonic power at the heart of the pandemic? Why do some people refuse to wear masks? Why does a small minority, including some government officials, believe that the pandemic itself is a hoax, that there is no pandemic? Why did the President of the United States a month ago claim that, quote, we had turned the corner in terms of progress with the pandemic only for the purpose of furthering his own political advantage? And while cases of the new infections, all this taking place while new infections were skyrocketing. An old professor of mine commented offhandedly, being takes care of its own. I might add that non-being does likewise. Beware. Our only hope is that this culture wakes up to this inevitable, ominous outcome. Tillich was prophetic in many ways, and perhaps some of his words, published after his death, concludes with these remarks on a more positive note. There is only one way, everywhere, and in every possible way, we as individuals must fight against the forces of destruction, first in ourselves, then on a group level. We must work for anything that will bring people together. But, he adds, only in encounters will love and justice become creatively one. Thank you very much. Thank you. I somehow can't hear you.
Sorry, this
Oh,
happens.
there we go.
This happens a lot. Yeah.
Thank you for the applause, Werner.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. So as I said at the beginning, let's take 2 questions or 2 comments. You can either raise your hand or just put your question in the chat window.
Oh, come on, take me over the coals.
Yeah. Maybe say something kind of related to it, you know.
May I add something that
yeah,
Werner
Werner
go
has
ahead,
a
Werner.
question. Yeah, Werner.
Well, Fred, I really very much enjoyed that. That was lovely and terrifying at the same time.
Thank you.
But I guess my real question is, what does that look like then? If you identify the people who are simply denying this heart of darkness, and how do we bring people together then? Does Tillich give us tools to actually move beyond that, to reach the people that clearly don't want to be reached right now? What do we do?
Well, to your first sentence, Werner, those who don't accept the darkness become much more vulnerable to it. And I think we need a political will to make people more aware. I am always shocked to see meetings in Washington under our current president where many people are still not wearing masks. I am shocked to hear that the governor of one of the Dakotas says masks are optional and I will not make it absolute. I think 2 of the states that have taken a lead in this transformation or in this seeking to recreate a more stable society are California and New York, the 2 of the states, 2 of my home states. What they have done is mandated a great number of things, have pointed out how dangerous this is, are trying to make people aware. And of the problem. Governor Gavin Christopher Newsom, I know his middle name because he was a student of mine 30 years ago. I never thought he would amount to be governor of California, I might add, is on all of the local news stations, the three major networks, every day at noon, sometimes for a half hour, sometimes longer, discussing the daily dangers of the pandemic, of working to make people aware of what little progress we are making. We need much stronger political action on the part of all our government, from city, county, state to national. I'll end, I'm talking too long, but my hope is that the new administration, did I lose you? Oh dear.
Yeah, so I just stopped sharing my screen so people can see each other. Yeah.
Oh, right. My hope is that the new administration under President-elect Biden will make real serious changes in helping to make the nation aware of how serious this is. Does that help, Verna?
Yes, and there's still a lot of hurdles to get past.
Oh, enormous hurdle.
There.
That's why
But
I suggested in the paper, this is ominous.
I think some of the other papers may address some of those other crises that we have to get past.
Yeah. So let's pick up one question. John, Mary has one question. John has one question. I kind of like guarantees for any question that's not yet been addressed in this round, we can do it in the global discussion. So Mary's question is, can you elaborate more on love and justice in facing the pandemic? So Mary, so is this your question? Do you want to specify, what do you exactly want from the elaboration? Mary, are you there? Oh, no. Okay, good. So
can I add one more comment? Marion's paper was much more Tillichian, I think, than mine. I was much more political and social, and I tried to keep mine a little bit shorter than hers. So I hope she finds this paper and we can make it available to everyone in the society.
Good, but this Mary is our speaker Mary. I don't think it's the same. No, it's not Marion. It's Mary. It's one of our audience, and her question is: can you elaborate more on love and justice in facing the pandemic?
That's a wonderful question. I have to say I'd have to go back and reread Love, Power, and Justice for the 12th time to answer that specifically. And I don't have a copy with me. I'm speaking from Tucson, Arizona, and I'm not near my books. But I think one of the things that Tillich says in LPJ is that you cannot have love without power and justice, and you cannot have power or authentic power without love and justice, and so on. And one of the things that bothers me is that I think we've had very little religious leadership in all of this. These are the people that America, and both Protestant and Catholic, these are the people that America looks to for leadership in crises. And I've been very disappointed in, certainly as a Catholic, in what the Catholic bishops have said, and what Catholic leaders in general have said about it. They need to say more, and they need to realize that if Jesus preached love, we need to preach that more frequently.
Good. I think lots of the issue is just hovering around every people's mind, and I believe lots of themes addressed will be pop up continually in the global discussion. So let's move on. The next speaker is Dr. Benjamin Chika, my great friend, and also we learned together in Boston University. Very happy to see you, Ben. So her presentations, Tillich, pandemic, and video games. So Ben, if you want to share your screen, you can do it now. Ben, you need to unmute yourself.
So worried about sharing my screen, I forgot to unmute myself.
Yeah, it's okay now. You can reshare.
All right. So you should see the slide now.
Yeah.
Okay. So mine will be a little bit more uplifting, actually, despite everything going on. So here's the setup.
Ben, I think the screen you share is for the speaker mode. Can you change to the audience mode?
Ugh.
Yeah.
Good grief. Okay.
Oh, good.
Are we good, Ben? All right.
Yeah.
Giving the video game talk and screwing up the technology. Wonderful start. Anyway, for the past 6 years or so, I've been analyzing and speaking at video game industry events, and this is going to be what I'm going to do. So here's the setup. Before I get to the pandemic, I'm going to briefly describe what Gamergate was and how its aftermath exhibits theological depth, in my opinion. And then I'm going to provide some examples of games to support that claim. And then I'm going to show how such meaningful games have been equipped to get around some of the limitations imposed by the pandemic. And then again, an example. So that's where I'm going. So Gamergate, in brief, was a campaign of harassment within the video game industry against women and other minorities that started in 2014. It started when some women developers started creating very experimental, different sorts of video games. And just because they were up to something different, they got harassed. And then some members of the video game press applied critical theory to what was happening, pointing out problematic tropes that exist within the video game industry and that these alternatives are actually necessary. And they also got harassed. And it got so bad that the FBI eventually had to get involved. There were very serious death threats involved in all of this. Now, one way I would describe heteronomy is the destruction of autonomous creations by external force, basically one group latching on to a polar tension of life and using it as something to bludgeon another group with, and that would be a pretty good definition of Gamergate. But when I look at what was happening, and I think of Tillich, just like Tillich always prophetically critiqued cultural distortions, those people who were attacked in Gamergate pushed back instead of remaining silent. And in doing so, they opened up new opportunities within the gaming industry for the affirmation of identities that aren't always easy to affirm in everyday life. So this picture is, I took it at PAX East 2015 in Boston, which is attended by over 80,000 people over the weekend. And this was the first, PAX is the biggest fan convention in the United States. There's 3 in Seattle, Boston, and San Antonio. They're all about that big. And this was the first PAX after Gamergate erupted, and they introduced the first diversity lounge ever at that PAX, and this is now at every single PAX convention. And it's a safe space to go if you're harassed at PAX. It's also a place where you'll find allies, lots of LGBTQ info booths, and also vendors that support LGBTQ causes and the like. And this is now present at all PAX conventions. And I'm, again, looking at this through a Tillichian lens, just like Tillich was able to identify something new and hopeful happening in the wake of 2 world wars when he was writing, I see the violent disruptions created by Gamergate making space for new sorts of great games to break through. So this happened in the community, but then new sorts of games started emerging in the wake of Gamergate. So there's now games about coming out as a lesbian in high school and the ups and downs of that experience that are actually made by development teams with lesbian members. That's what Gone Home is about. And because these are not just passive stories, but gamers interact with them, they get to be in a space and an environment in which they're actively expressing themselves while interacting with characters that might share their identity. So in short, there's lots of games where historically marginalized people can explore identities and have those identities affirmed in these different sorts of games. If Found is another wonderful example of this. It's a game about a transgender woman and just how she's treated differently by friends and family. But as you can see on the screen, the controller in the game is this eraser icon. And it wonderfully conveys how when people use the wrong name or the wrong pronouns, that can feel like being erased, but also how the opposite can feel like reversing the process and being created anew for the first time. So I've spoken at a lot of fan conventions about this sort of stuff. And almost every single time I give a talk, some LGBTQ gamers, especially transgender gamers, come up to me and basically say they feel like they get to be their essential selves in these video games in ways that are still practically impossible day to day in our world when things like bathrooms are still debated. And when they tell me that, what I see happening is that for those facing social oppression and isolation, these games are a real means of fulfillment and affirmation, not unlike Tillich thought theology could provide the courage to be for people experiencing meaningless. I think those are very closely related. So that's the general idea. Now here's what's happening in the pandemic. This is Rami Ismail. He is an independent video game developer, and he's also a Muslim. And these are images of the video game Animal Crossing, which you might have heard of because it just became huge during the pandemic. It's on the Nintendo Switch. And it's a very simple game where players just create, they have a little island, and they just design it. They create a building, they decorate it, they build an outdoor space, they farm crops and other items, and they sell those for in-game currency, and then they just use that currency to decorate the island. There's no winning or losing, it's just kind of express yourself in the space. But what Ismail did was, because everybody was stuck at home, and Ramadan was happening, and it was in the midst of stay-at-home orders, when the first iftar was approaching and it was time to break the fast, he created a space in Animal Crossing where Muslims could gather together in the game to break the fast together instead of just being isolated. So I'm going to let him explain that in his own words in a short video.
The sense of community, the sense of togetherness, the sense of celebration, I tried to get a little bit back. And Animal Crossing ended up being the place where I could do that.
So you tweeted out, hey, I'm doing Ramadan in Animal Crossing. What kind of response did you expect?
I put a call out on Twitter, and I kind of expected maybe 5 to 10 people to respond. And the response was so immediately overwhelming that I just couldn't keep up with how many messages I was getting.
When people come to your Animal Crossing island, what are you doing?
I built this little place that is very much inspired by the places that I saw growing up around Egypt, where during Ramadan, there would be these big communal tables or even just carpets on the ground with food. You wouldn't necessarily know everybody there, but for a moment, you'd be family. We will turn on this group phone call with some friends of mine that are visiting, sometimes complete strangers from all over the world. Some are fasting, some of them are not.
What made everybody want to come to this?
It's like the feeling of not being alone during Ramadan. It feels pretty comforting.
So I'm gonna close on this. I find that fascinating because not only did Rami Ismail doing this get around limitation of the pandemic and the inability to meet in person, but the pandemic actually brought forth an unrealized possibility. So there's some Christian churches that have done similar things and had Easter services and Animal Crossing. But in this example, many of the people who visited Ismail's island were in cities where there are few to no other Muslims or places like colleges with poor support for non-Christian students. So breaking the fast in Animal Crossing was actually a better experience for them than breaking the fast outside of the game by themselves. Not unlike my example of some transgender gamers feel like they're more themselves inside of games. So the wrapping up, kind of putting a bow on it, is I see a theonomous culture here. Like just like in a theonomous culture, people are thirsting for deep meaning in the video games, finding it and really putting it into action. So that's my more hopeful version of the pandemic in video games. And I'll just end on a plug in that my book about all this is coming out next year through Baylor. And that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chika. So let's pick 2 comments or 2 questions from the audience.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Rachel.
Benjamin, first off, that was really, really cool to hear about. And secondly, I'm curious about, like, as you were speaking, I was thinking a lot about embodiment and how even if it's virtual embodiment, there's still like more reality to our enfleshed nature. And I'm curious if you explore a little bit of that in the book, or have you thought about that and just what your thoughts are in relation to that concept?
Yeah, I've not thought about, I mean, there's like specific literature on embodiment, but there's a decent amount of growing scientific data. And if you talk to people who like love and play video games, they'll just tell you this is the case. They're not just virtual. I mean, these things impact us physically. And I worked in a lab back when I was a doctoral student in California that does work on oxytocin and how it impacts our relations with each other. And it seems like it's actually released when we're interacting online and in these virtual environments too. So I haven't thought about embodiment per se, but everything points to like these things impact us just like physical interactions impact us.
That's really cool. Thanks.
Nice. And anyone else?
I've got a question.
Yeah, Excel.
More or less, one of the, I guess, real challenges of gaming culture is the role of symbol, and the fact that who creates the symbol, more or less, that the symbol is very deeply commodified, that video games there aren't a lot of free video games, and a lot of culture within gaming communities is transactional, right? It's the producers of the gaming industry who create it for the consumers of gaming industry. I'm just sort of wondering what the video game economic model might have to say about, maybe even make us question, I suppose, the role of games in society and the real theonomous aspect of games in society. Does that follow? Am I just making up word garbage?
No, I mean, so some thoughts come to mind, and you can let me know if I'm on point with your question or not. So yeah, you're right that certainly video games are made to be sold and make money. And if people don't make money making their games and then selling them, they can't keep making video games. But something that has happened in the wake of Gamergate is a lot of the old terrible tropes, like if you play fantasy video games from 10, 15, 20 years ago, all of the male characters are in massive armor, and female characters, their armor is bikinis. Like that stuff isn't allowed anymore. Like there's been enough pressure that you've got to do better, regardless of how big a studio you are. Like, so even the most popular video games now, they don't get away with that anymore. I'm going to share my screen again briefly in that I wasn't going to bring this up, but I think it relates. Actually, I'll just mention it. There's a website called itch.io, and a lot of these experimental novel sorts of games that are happening, that are coming out, they're put out there for free. Like, just try them, experience them. And when the Black Lives Matter protests broke out this summer, this website where developers are making next to nothing off their games, or they might be charging $2, very little amounts of money, they put together a bundle of video games and sold it to raise money for Black Lives Matter. And they had an initial goal of $100,000, and all proceeds went towards it. So these are like struggling small video game developers that decided this bigger thing was more important than them making some money off their game. They eventually raised over $8 million with a $100,000 initial goal. And another bundle raised over $4 million. And for context, Amazon gave $10 million. So these small independent video game developers outgave Amazon to Black Lives Matter. So.
Good. As a moderator, I kind of like abuse my privilege. I want to say something on this topic. It's really, I think the young scholars are quite, Rachel and Axel, we are excited on this. I have a daughter, 7 years old. She play video game. I try to control her consumption time of the video games. And one reason I'm very, as a Confucian scholar, one reason to dream in this society is because Paul Tillich, compared to other Christian theologians, has a more positive attitude towards culture, the new technology, science, this humanistic spirit, right? That is, but on the other hand, I think Tillich can provide a transcending moral criteria or theological criteria for us to reflect upon the cultural development. So Ben, I think one direction when I watch your your presentation is maybe we can use a video game to facilitate people's spiritual formation, like a prayer, like a meditation, right? Any tradition come together just to play the video games steps after step. Maybe you can become a spiritually very adept practitioner. I don't know how this happened. I hope, in that case, all the members in this society probably will evolve into a new round of capitalist consumption behavior. Maybe earn some money from it. Yeah, that's my, yeah. Do you have any response, Ben?
Well, I will say, I mean, I was just invited last weekend to speak at the Korean Church of Boston to their youth and high school, youth, college and young adult groups about video games and their spiritual lives, and around the theme of doing a better job of loving our neighbors no matter what, and talking about how these video games put you into direct contact with all of these historically marginalized others. And you actually get to experience and interact with them as characters with fleshed out stories rather than talking points. So yeah, I mean, I've talked about that. I think that's my angle right now, but I totally think that's possible, that video games can develop a sort of empathy not unrelated to spiritual practices.
Okay. Good. Yeah, let's table this for the global discussion. So our next speaker is from Germany, Professor Ilona Nord, and from University of Augsburg. And her talk is Tillich Populism and the Existential Crisis. I highly look forward to it. I believe the talk will address some issues we already discussed. So Ilona, go ahead.
Thank you so much for introducing me. And I have to say, I really feel very much honored to be asked to give my talk today here. I will read my talk. Please excuse that I'm a bit more sticking to my text. In a 1942 broadcast memorial in Voice of America, Paul Tillich says, "The sense of freedom is lost when insecurity and fear fill the day and disturb the night. One then gets into a mood where security means everything and freedom means nothing. If this happens 1,000,000 times over, democracy is lost." End of quotation. I paraphrase for the year 2020, where health means everything and freedom means nothing. In this situation, democracy is lost. In short, this is the position that many people of the anti-corona movement in Germany agree with. In November 2020, a situation arose in Germany as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which part of the population acted and further acts as if they believed that the citizens' sense of freedom was not only lost, but taken away. "We for the basic law," that is one slogan. Another one is freedom, peace, justice, and love. On signs of the demonstrators, there is also "for truth, justice, and freedom." Those who take part in the demonstrations are portrayed in news broadcasts with sometimes wild and abstruse positions. An intense and controversial discussion about their position has not yet taken place. Possibly because the liberal structure of our democracy reveals one of its weaknesses here. I cite Jan Werner Müller, teaching at Princeton. He's a political science. He's working in political science. There is a tendency that liberals marginalize oppositional populist groups. One excludes in the name of morality, just as populists morally exclude some citizens from the true, trying to have homogeneous people. But instead of morally discrediting, liberal Democrats should first discuss, if only to set the facts straight. In cases where populists incite sedition or even incite violence, criminal law applies. But in all others, one must now claim the requirements of the citizens seriously. A revolt of the decent, who pat each other on the back of their decency, is not enough. End of quotation. Populism is part of democracy. The churches have even incorporated it into their models and understandings of the organization. The concept of the People's Church makes this obvious. The point is not to exclude and abolish populism, but to recognize it as a political phenomenon. Its influence must also be countered by political means, that is, by discussion and the rule of law. That is by no means an easy task, has been shown by last week's German political events. The influence and scope of the current right-wing populism in Germany is considerable. With the attitude that they are the true people, representatives of the so-called lateral thinkers movement not only verbally attack the government of the country, but they also personally invade the building of the Reichstag, the seat of parliament. They are of the opinion that the people are currently represented by false, corrupt elites who cheat them by their basic rights. In alliance with the political party Alternative for Germany, AfD, the intruders have succeeded in penetrating the offices of some members of parliament, threatening and insulting them. They were given this opportunity by the right of two deputies of the AfD who had legitimized these persons as guests. The political symbolism of this attack was intensified in the background by a petition against an amendment to the Infection Protection Act. It has been published via openpetition.de. The new paragraph lists concrete measures, distance commandments, mask obligation, contact restrictions, meeting and travel prohibitions, as well as closures. It sets higher hurdles for the restriction of demonstrations and services, exit restrictions and visits in hospitals and nursing homes can be limited only with difficulty. The law also states that health protection alone must no longer be the sole consideration of social and economic aspects when issuing ordinances. The incidence value of 35 up to 50 new infections per day and 100,000 inhabitants is made transparent as a benchmark. Central to these legal regulations was the criticism that the legal principle that all essential decisions must be made by the legislator, the parliament. The corona measures were not taken by parliament, but by the governments. In the petition, the amendment to the law is now linked to the Enabling Act of 1933. The law is said to be tantamount to an enabling basis for the government. In the Enabling Act of March 24, 1933, the German Reichstag decided at that time that the legislative power was in fact completely transferred to Adolf Hitler. It is now to be suggested that the current government be seen as a corona dictatorship. It is suggested to the public that these are one-time registrations of fundamental rights. The legal side of enabling principles and their regular legal regulation within democracies is not discussed. Instead, a status confessionis is called for, in that the protection of human dignity by the state is seen to be in jeopardy. The fact that registrations on fundamental rights are part of the state's legal action is ignored, and Corona is stylized as an absolute exception in the literal sense of the word. The pandemics no longer threaten the health of individuals alone, but societies as a whole. Rudolf Stichweh, sociologist in Germany, says, building up a social immune system for pandemics will be the main task for the coming months and years. And this is independent of and more important than the question of whether and when we have vaccinations and therapies against COVID-19. In addition, he describes the system of religions as the real loser of the corona crisis. The reason for this is that, I quote, apparently nowhere are religious interpretations of the virus-induced crisis events available and play a relevant role, end of quotation. I started this article or speech or talk with a quotation from Tillich, which emphasizes the freedom of man and woman. He did that in recourse to the context of National Socialism. An analogy arises that can be personally unpleasant and politically unappetizing, as Jan Werner Müller once put it. It is important to me to mention this, and there is one thing more. Tillich's theology will hardly be able to provide adequate answers to today's questions and a grand interpretation of the crisis. Rather, for me, the potential of his philosophical theology lies elsewhere. He calls for us to think again about the question of freedom and how to deal with it in the pandemic. Tillich follows on from ancient philosophy when he says, I quote, man is who is free, and free is who participates in the self-determination of the historical group to which he belongs. Civil rights, freedom, and humanitarianism are identical, end of quotation. Both sides of freedom, the natural and the historical, belong together. In a crisis like the pandemic, it is essential that this insight is not lost. The many people whose existence is economically destroyed, who lose their independence from state subsidies and their self-efficacy, they are also robbed of their creativity and thus debased. For Tillich, freedom is closely related to the possibility of individual creative activity. This is more than a reason to take to the streets and fight for freedom and justice. There is a lack of clear social solidarity with those who are existentially affected by the pandemic. There is a lack of social agencies that intervene and dissolve the opposition between lateral thinkers like AfD and government parliament. The concept and experience of freedom is a core element of the social and political constitution, as well as of Tillich's theology and philosophy. There is a clear public need to develop their meaning. Thanks for your attention.
That's great. You know, I think some of the previous questions is highly relevant to the topic you are discussing, you know, Ilona. So I will pick up from John. You know, in the past discussion, John has a question, John Tantamanio. Is there any concrete guidance from Tillich on how to help people to break free from the grip of the demonic once they are in its hold?
I have to go. I did not get the question really good. So what is the demonic side of the?
Yeah, you talk about the populism, right? Yeah, John, can you elaborate? Can you have some conversation with Ilona?
Well, it sounds like Ilona would be reluctant to use a term like the demonic for populist movements. I would suppose they have to cross a certain kind of threshold into violence before she would be prepared to use such a term. But the question is really for a number of the papers already, and it comes from my students. I mean, I'm teaching Tillich this semester, and they keep asking this question. We really appreciate Tillich's analysis of the power of idols and how the demonic can emerge. But once he's given us that analysis, we don't see resources for helping people emerge out of the grip of the kind of fanaticism and the fracturing of personality that can take place. And I haven't been able to answer them particularly well either, because I think they seem to be right, that Tillich doesn't have a clear answer. Sometimes he seems to suggest that the demonic opposition just has to be defeated.
Yes, I will totally agree to that. That the demonic should be defeated. That there should be a really clear opposition to that. But on the other hand, I guess that Tillich is talking about the ambivalences. And what I could see in the last days in Germany, in that really striking events, was that the people who were against the corona regulars, that they were not really taken earnest in their in their intention to show what they are moved by. And I guess that question for freedom is one which is also related to people's creativity. And if you are not allowed to go out or to meet and to have talks to neighbors and to meet, there is not much creativity left for having a really a good exchange on all that what is happening during the pandemic. And so I guess, yes, there are demonic sides, and I try to illustrate that by that events in the Reichstag. But if we are too quick to see people in that demonic sphere, we will not be able to take their intentions seriously. And that is what I've found in what I think what is important to Tillich's theology, that he has that polarization of freedom and destiny. And I underlined that side of freedom because I think we have to talk more about that freedom, that people are really in the state that they can decide what should happen. And if they are not allowed to decide anything, there will be more opposition to every rule a government is publishing.
Yeah, I believe lots of people have further thought, but we have an input in the chat window. It's from Ben Supan. It says, thanks to Ilona's paper and thanks to John for your question. I have a similar feeling. It seems to me Tillich's idea of demonic has a strong explanatory power, but unable to provide a concrete direction for certain phenomena. Nevertheless, I'm wondering maybe Tillich never intends to do so. So Ben, why do you think Tillich never intends to do so? And do you have any specific question to ask about our speaker?
Was that directed at me, Ben?
Ben, I cannot see your profile here. Can you unmute yourself and speak?
Sure, can you hear me?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, because I'm right now writing something about Tillich's concepts of the demonic. Yeah, I have a feeling that it can kind of explain some phenomenon. It can, for example, from some historical perspective, from a social perspective, to analyze a problem from a, from the concept of the demonic. But it seems that I can't find any kind of this idea, as John said, concretely to, if a demonic is a power, so so maybe there is another power compared with the demonic, and so that some direction maybe for the church or for other Christian communities, so they can they have some kind of a some kind of a prescription for the problem they are facing. So I just want to ask you all if you can have some insight about this question.
So the question go to Ilona, right? Yeah, Ilona.
Yeah, I'm not sure if if I got it right. The concept of the demonic is related to the view that, or put it in other words, as long as we exist, there are dimensions of the demonic present in the political sphere, in the private sphere. So this is part of all activities, and it's the task to see how we can overcome that. So that is what I would see here, if I got it right, because I did not develop my paper from that point of view. It was I'm hesitating to see somehow the populism in the context of the demonic. I guess populism is a part of democracy, and I would not judge on populism as a demonic political action or movement. So that is a question of the hermeneutics. If you see populism in a more moral or ethical way, or in terms of political science, which is less related to morality. Is that an answer? I don't know.
It is a very inspiring comment. I think populism, the reason populism is because elitism. So, Tillich, for theological thinking, the transcendent mode of thinking, if we have some negative opinion towards populism, equally, we must pay attention to the origin of populism. So populism cannot be, I think, according to Ilona, automatically tantamount to demonic force, because the origin, elitism, maybe also have some demonic force there, right? So I think John puts out a very good link there. Trump supporter in New York Times opinion, column. That's also one of my research focus. I try to understand the other side, why they do so. They maybe have some reason, and maybe intellectuals, professors in the academia must not only, you know, morally critique them, but, you know, have some reflection upon ourselves. I think this creates a whole new way of discussion for our global session. So right now, I think the discussion is very exciting. I really look forward to further comments. So Ilona, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, just a short comment. I was very much impressed by Jan Werner Müller's analysis of populism. And what I found there is that there should be at least part of critique going back to our own attitudes in terms of liberal politics. And here we should see that that liberalism has weak sides, and this is the critique populist movements are doing and addressing, and we should care about that.
Yeah, very good. I see Roland Stone raise your hand, and also Rich Holmes want to say something. I will recommend to, you know, put all this discussing in the global session. So really need to move on. I believe, you know, I remember you raise your hand, so I would not forget to let you speak. For the time wise, let's move on to Professor Russell Demani. He is from Boston University. He is also the general editor of the complete English translation of Tillich's politics works. And his talk is Crisis or Chaos, Tillich Reflection on the Time of COVID-19. So Russell, go ahead.
Brilliant, thank you, Ben. That's exactly the moment when my screen froze. So it's been fine for all of this time, but it froze the moment you passed on to me. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
yes.
Great, thank you. It's just the sentient particles of the internet that know. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you today. And there's always a certain risk, I suppose, in going last in these things. You know, so firstly, that all the tricky questions have been posed beforehand, which is great. But of course, none of those tricky questions have really been answered. So they all end up reflecting themselves back onto me. So you know, we'll see how that goes. I'm also, of course, delighted to be able to talk to you from home on my own time frame, rather than having to pretend that I'm genuinely still awake after the Tillich banquet, which is always a slightly difficult ask. But that does mean that I may be interrupted by small people. It's a persistent challenge of being on Zoom, is that small people don't realise that you ought not to be interrupted. So if anyone does interrupt me, then my apologies for that. I want to, well, I don't really have a paper as such. Okay, I'll bring the small people in. If I get in trouble, I'll bring them in. You'll notice that. So I don't have a paper as such, but I've got a number of thoughts that I want to kind of sort of present to you, I suppose. So my comments today seek to explore. I do have a text, so I'm going to kind of half read and half not read. My comments today seek to explore some initial Tillichian inspired reflections on the prospects of theologizing in the situation of COVID-19. And I want to focus on specifically on the question of interpretation of time in our current situation. As a sort of advert, I'm going to suggest that the current situation is not best thought theologically as a time of crisis, but rather that the alternative theological conception of time, namely kairos, may be more promising. So our panel today is set up as thinking about 2020 crises. And I want slightly to push back on that notion of the language of crises, because I think there's quite a lot that's not really spelled out in that, and I want to try and spell that out a bit further. So our discussion today invited theological reflections on our experiences with and engaging with Tillich of the global or of 2020 in the context of crisis, and of course the dominant crisis is that of COVID-19. Of course, Tillich agrees with this idea that we ought to think in relation to, theologically, we ought to think in relation to our contemporary, what Tillich called situation. Tillich counselled that situation cannot be neglected in theology without dangerous consequences. That's a quote. As the health emergency and its immediate consequences unfold, and less immediate consequences, I should also add, it's clear that the current global health pandemic does indeed constitute a new situation. I think in Tillich's definition, a situation is, quote, the scientific and artistic, the economic, political and ethical forms in which we seek to express our interpretation of existence. I think it's fair to say that the global health pandemic has provided a new situation. So my contribution today seeks to explore how to theologize in that situation, as I say, focusing specifically on the question of the theological interpretation of time. And I want to suggest that we ought not, or there are good reasons to resist the idea of thinking that we can think theologically in terms of crisis, but instead that maybe the idea of kairos may be more fruitful. So first, some initial context. I should say this is a larger paper which I've tried to condense down to something resembling 10 minutes. So at times the jumps will be pretty kind of crunching, as it were. So why think about time at all? Why is time relevant for theologizing? Well, of course, as we know, Tillich sets out his thinking about space and time, in particular in his paper, The Struggle Between Space and Time, included as chapter 3 in Theology of Culture. Here, Tillich claims that space, quote, space and time stand in a tension with each other, which may be considered as the most fundamental tension in existence. And I would say this tension is clearly visible in the pressing need to adopt a temporal rather than a spatial vision for theologizing. I should also say that, sorry, there's an interruption here. Time just means I'm going to turn the light on, so that's weird. It's starting to get dark here. Tillich, human existence under the predominance of space is tragic. Associated by Tillich with the Greek mind and its ultimate symbol of the sphere of the circle, spatial thinking condemns humanity to the logic of repetition, in which genuine novel alternatives are unimaginable. The consequences of spatial thinking should be clear. Spatial conceptions of theology can only ever reproduce the same, the given present, in a different form. As such, this approach amounts to nothing more than a reshuffling of the cards, and hence fails as a radical critique of the status quo, which I kind of take for granted is kind of what theology is about. By contrast, it is for Tillich the temporal imagination that frees humanity from the circle of spatiality. He writes, quote, in the human mind, this tension between time and space becomes conscious and gets historical power. And further, that in man, humanity, the final victory of time is possible. Man is able to act towards something beyond his death. He is able to have history, breaking through the circle of repetition towards something new. Of course, for Tillich, the vital turning point here is what he calls the birth of prophetism, out of paganism and against paganism. Against the gods of space, the prophet announces the idea of the monotheistic god of time. And here's a quick quote from Tillich. The god of time is the god of history. This means, first of all, that he is the god who acts in history towards a final goal. History has a direction. Something new is to be created in and through it. The goal is described in different terms: universal blessedness, the victory of demonic powers, represented as imperialistic notions, the coming of the kingdom of God in history, beyond history, the transformation of the form of this world, and so on. There are many symbols, some more imminent, as in old prophetism and modern Protestantism, some more transcendent, as in later apocalyptic and traditional Christianity. But in all these cases, time is directing, creating something new, a new creature, as Paul calls it. This is still Tillich. The tragic circle of space is overcome. There is a definite beginning and a definite end in history. Okay, so as a Tillichian, or at least a group of people sympathetic, perhaps, to a Tillichian approach, we might agree that theology ought to engage time. But which conception of time? How do we think about time theologically? And of course, there are three classical options here: chronos, crisis, and kairos. And basically, my contention here is that most theologians, the dominant theological mode, as it were, has been to think in terms of crisis. And what I'm suggesting instead is that we maybe ought to reorientate towards or shift towards a reflection in terms of kairos. I'm not going to say about chronos, we know all about that. So to crisis. For theologians of Tillich's generation, the First World War and its aftermath represented their defining situation. And many were quick to frame it as a time of crisis, a time of exception, in which teleo-chronological conceptions of time, characteristic of late 19th century modernity, the famous depiction of Hegel, they were challenged and were replaced by the idea of time as crisis. With relevant medical connotations, interesting to connect the idea of crisis with its original Greek location within thinking as a medical context. Crisis indicates a time of decision, a turning point that suspends mundane time. It is, in the term favoured by Karl Barth, the time between the times. In this, of course, Barth typifies the theological mood that came to dominate 20th century thought. Not just theological, I think. With its perpetual sense of crisis and states of exception, and the concomitant injunctions to new decision points in response. We've come to think, seemingly perpetually toppling from one crisis to another, stuck, it appears, forever between the times, whilst always yearning for some sort of atemporal rupture. And here, I can't go into this more fully, but I've got further elements that draw on Reinhard Koselleck, who relates the idea of crisis to particularly modern thinking, modern ways of thinking about time. That sort of post-Kant, we have this idea that that progress kind of happens through crisis. There's this kind of revolutionary understanding of time. And of course here, the other reference is Giorgio Agamben. And as many of you will know, Agamben has made some sort of, well, how can I put this politely, slightly controversial comments about COVID-19, but grounded in this idea that he feels there's this sort of need to resist the idea of the characterization of our time as a time of crisis. That in accepting that we are in a time of crisis, we kind of perpetuate and reaffirm what he would claim as a kind of neo-capitalist sort of state of exception. Yeah. By contrast, of course, Tillich sought to interpret his situation as a time, and by extension our situation, as a time of kairos. This idea of the fullness of time, or of course in Tillich's famous phrase, the eternal now. In a time of kairos, time is thickened. It's pregnant with opportunity for renewal. It's ripe for grasping. A kairotic interpretation does not drive to a tipping point of decision. Instead, it seeks to discern and to see the mundane more clearly in the heightened intensity of the moment. The point is that in a crisis, we're sort of drawn to what's new and different. In a kairos, we're drawn to what's made apparent to us. Of course, in the Renaissance, this was characterized as fortuna or occasio, characterized as the opportune moment, the moment in which these things become apparent. Kairos encapsulates the theological mood of a productive synthesis, of a resilient and a sort of a realist hope for opportunity in the midst of the ambiguities of existence in time. How does this kind of cash out in Tillichian terms? Well, I'm just going to jump and here. What's left is a few kind of reference points. In 1954, Tillich participated in that year's Erasmus Tagung, where he spoke on the theme of the importance of new being for Christian theology. He contrasted himself with those other speakers who were advantaged by dealing with historical material. Tillich thought he was not just a historian, but also a theologian. And he proposed instead to seek to bring out, quote, the hidden philosophy of his own Christian theology. He began his defense of the idea of the new being in Christian theology by reflecting on three elements necessary for any theology. And these three elements are theos, logos, and kairos. Theos, God, insofar as he makes himself manifest. These are quotes from Tillich. Logos, rational discourse about what God communicates when he communicates himself. And kairos, the proper moment in time, the time when a theologian must speak to his own age. For Tillich, no Christian systematic theology can dispense with those three elements. Without theos, quote, the element of revelation, then there is no theology. But likewise, without logos, there is no discourse. And without kairos, quote, we have merely a dead tradition. So what would we in a contemporary situation, how would we think of a kairotic, Tillichian inspired theology? Well, of course, we've got lots of issues, lots of questions that press upon us. Questions of gender, questions of race, questions of the environment. But perhaps overbearingly, we have the pandemic. We have the question of health. And I think here, to coin a phrase, what we need to think about is the meaning of health. We need to think about how health impacts upon these individual ethical considerations, these social, political, and indeed these global ecological considerations. Thinking in the context kairotically of the pandemic of COVID, how to integrate. We know that the pandemic involves every element. It involves individual reflection. Certain people suffer more. Certain people in certain places suffer more. Without the context of the environmental situation, we wouldn't be in this situation. So COVID-19 heightens our awareness of the tragic ambiguities of our temporal existence, with an increased awareness of our physical and psychological vulnerabilities, as well as our destructive engagement with the non-human and the injustices apparent in our societies, and the ambiguity of our faith in science and our embrace of technological solutions. I think that question about where are the faith communities is, I think, a really important one. Have they been diverted into science? It's a good question. But is this really a crisis? Ought we to think about this as a crisis? Or more precisely, do we restrict our potential theological responses to this situation by characterizing it as a crisis? Might instead an approach that seeks to interpret COVID-19 as a kairos have more theological promise? More theological promise. And do I have a few more minutes, Ben? 2 minutes? Okay, so in my 2 more minutes, what to provoke the constructive point, should we construe this in terms of crisis, of kairos rather than crisis? The question, which I think relates to what John Stamanel has raised, and I think this is an underlying theme here. Yeah, we ought to, maybe we ought to. But is that somehow empty? Is kairos itself too empty? I look back to, in 1948, Tillich talked about 3 meanings of kairos. He says, kairos, this is a quote, kairos in its unique and universal sense is, for Christian faith, the appearing of Jesus as the Christ. Kairos in its general and special sense, for the philosopher of history, is every turning point in history, in which the eternal judges and transforms the temporal. Kairos in its special sense, as decisive for our present situation, 1948, is the coming of a new theonomy on the soil of a secularized and emptied autonomous culture. But is that too empty? What does it mean, this secularized and emptied autonomous culture? Are there instead ambiguities in the characterization of COVID as kairotic? And I want to say here, obviously, we need to ignore those kind of rather clunky moves to theodicy or apocalypticism. That one, yeah. But we need to think about, and the points that Ilona raised, about popularism, nationalism, cronyism, and about the extent to which, yes, we're all here online together, but we're not together. There's ambiguities here. So thinking about COVID-19 as kairotic is ambiguous. And finally, perhaps, maybe, we ought to be more future orientated, or indeed more trans-temporally. That's to say, thinking about the past, the present, and the future. And I'll just kind of finish with a quote from John Clayton, from one of those. It's one of those pieces on Tillich that I keep going back to, and it's critical, but I hope and think it is also provocative to us. Clayton, in his 1985 piece, Tillich and the Art of Theology, he says Tillich's intention to do theology in the situation accounts in large measure for both his success and failure. It helps account for his tendency constantly to remove and remold individual concepts and to experiment with them in different combinations and different contexts, thinking, for example, about demonic in our current situation. but it also accounts for many of the glaring inconsistencies in his thought, for his own tendency not to take them too seriously. Finally, it accounts for his significance and his limitation for a theology of the future. From Tillich, one can learn to do theology kata kairos. Other things one must learn elsewhere. And with that provocation, I think I've probably finished my allocated minutes.
Good. Thank you, Russell. Thank you. You know, what's such a order of a presentation? The Kairos really give us some hope, right? Some promising vision of a crisis. You know, the general theme of the panel is Tillich and the 2020 crisis. We ends with the Kairos. Well, such a positive tone here. You know, after you know, according to my original suggestion, every speaker has two commented. You know, we can have 2 comments or 2 questions. I see great question from a lawyer. So because of time-wise issue, after I read the lawyer's question and Russell answers it, I will end the record and we will go to the global discussion. Sounds good? Okay, lawyer's question, equally provocative as the quote you gave. Russell, I would be curious to hear your view on how Tillich would respond to American evangelical who also feel that COVID-19 is not a moment of crisis and that Trump is himself a Kairos moment in history. A great recent article argued how Trump has redefined the apocalyptic for American evangelicals in how they conflict their political interests with their theological interpretation, historical. You know, Russell, what do you think?
I'm clearly reluctant to make any comments with regards to American evangelical theology, or indeed the American situation as a mere outsider in that context. I think I would. What I'd want to say is that one of the interesting things, productive, I think, in lots of different ways, about thinking in terms of kairos rather than crisis, is that kairos, I think, somehow entails more ambiguity than crisis. So if you think in terms of crisis, I mean, this sort of, and again, I referred, I think, to Koselleck, and this is really interesting. This idea that the modern sense is that out of a crisis, something better comes. Yeah, there's this revolutionary idea that you know, so it's not so great now, but you know, something better is going to come out of it. Whereas if you think kind of kairotically, you think that you've kind of got everything. You've kind of got all of those ambiguities. You've got the, you know, the positive and the negative. You've got the finite and the eternal. You've got the sense that everything that I say, you know, look, so we're being recorded, yeah. So what I say now is of bearing to the people who are listening to me now, but it's also being recorded, so it's therefore being preserved in some way. So there's this kind of sense in which the present moment is richer, bigger than simply the moment in which things flip over. Yeah, and so the kind of crisis thinking thinks about this idea that you can take a situation, you can pivot it to something else, i.e., something better. The kind of kairos thinking thinks, gosh, you know, the eternal, whatever we think this means, the eternal somehow kind of breaks through or impacts upon or is present to the finite. That's not simple. That's complex, ambiguous, transformative, and it's going to go in all sorts of different ways. And it's that kind of complexification that I think is interesting here. That's no answer to the question, but
lawyer, do you want to follow up? Or you are just happy to end here?
No, I mean, I would press on it a little bit in the sense that I find it interesting that this notion of kairos is being used quite prominently now within theological and in popular culture and in political circles. And there is a kind of a strange convergence. You mentioned, not using clunky definitions of apocalypticism, and that's exactly what's happening here in the example that I wrote. And I'll try to find the article and post it in the chat. But I also see that there needs to be a much more robust interaction with these interpretations from theologians across the spectrum to really challenge how we don't go into, this kind of easy superficialism of kairos as hope and opportunity and crisis as decision and yada, yada, yada. That just skims the surface, right? And Tillich allows us to really take that more robustly. And I think your presentation also did that too. And so that's why I was kind of curious how this particular article, which calls out those evangelicals for being so blithe with their particular movement for their own self-interest, I think would have a very interesting conversation here with your particular perspective and that of Tillich.
Good. Yeah. Russell,
Yeah,
do you want to respond?
I don't have much more to add, but I would like to read that article and to find out more about that. I'm obviously thinking in my own kind of situation, my own context here, but I guess my kind of the sort of broader point is really to seek to kind of resist this characterization of our situation in terms of crisis. And I think, Agamben, as I say, I referred to him earlier, he's gotten all sorts of trouble for his sort of, comments on this, rightly in many ways. But there's there are clearly how you characterize the time in which we live is really important. And I think, we ought to explore at least the potential for kind of characterizing our time and our situation kairotically, rather than simply kind of buying into this notion of crisis. That's the general point.
Good, thank you, Russell. So I will end the record.